The sun scorched the endless frontier, where one woman's quiet desperation would soon echo across the dusty plains. Margaret Turner, heavy with child, stumbled through the desert, her lips cracked and her skin burning under the relentless sky. Betrayed and abandoned, she felt each heartbeat as a final drumroll before doom. Yet in that unforgiving wilderness, where hope was a feeble flicker, a fateful encounter with a compassionate Sioux man would transform her darkest hour into a testament of courage. If you think you've heard every Wild West tale, brace yourself. This is the untold story of a woman's will to survive and a stranger's boundless mercy. The spring of 1875 promised the Turners something better, something that at the time felt almost within reach. Margaret Turner, or Maggie as she was known to her friends, sat perched on the edge of a battered wagon, her auburn hair tucked beneath a bonnet. She was only 23, bright-eyed and newly married to James Turner, who believed the riches of the West were ripe for the taking. When they married in a small church in St. Louis, Maggie's heart brimmed with possibilities. She had always dreamt of open skies and winding rivers, carrying them toward something grand, an untouched frontier where a determined couple could build a life. The Turners had heard countless stories. Rumors flew back east of booming mining towns and newly discovered veins of silver or gold, feeding the feverish hopes of settlers looking for fortune. In those early days, Maggie was so full of affection for her husband that she never questioned the reckless pace of his plans. James had been charming, dark-haired, tall, with a silver tongue that convinced any skeptic. He was the sort of man who'd spin elaborate images of a future filled with fertile farmland, shining home windows, and children playing in green pastures. And Maggie, heart ablaze with excitement, believed him. When James joined a small wagon train heading west from St. Louis, she was happy to ride by his side. But the reality of wagon travel soon hit her with a cold slap. The rickety caravan jolted and rattled. Nights brought a chill that seeped into the bones. Days brought dust that clogged her throat and eyes. Early on, Maggie fell ill with a low fever. She was pregnant, far more pregnant than she had realized before the journey began. James, fixated on his prospects, seemed indifferent to her weariness. He was always up front conferring with the lead wagon master or scanning the rocky ridges for signs of fresh water or hidden opportunity. Among the wagon train, the Turners met a few notable souls. Harriet O'Connell, a middle-aged widow in search of her grown sons out west. Young Billy Patterson, who had lost his parents to a fire and was traveling to meet an uncle in Denver. And Father Jameson, the traveling preacher who insisted on daily prayer. But these companions were more passing acquaintances than friends. Everyone kept to themselves, forging alliances only when necessity required it. As weeks dragged on, Maggie's belly grew, her ankles swelled, and her patience thinned. Occasionally, Father Jameson offered a protective ear. "Are you all right, dear child? You must rest for the sake of your baby." Exhausted, Maggie could only nod. Her husband, James, seemed too blinded by anticipation of wealth to notice her exhaustion. Each day he insisted the train push forward to the next landmark, Fort Laramie, perhaps, or a rumored outpost with fresh water. Even the wagon master, a stern man named Clyde Barrow, no relation to any famed gunslingers, he often told James they should slow down for Maggie's sake. But James brushed off every warning. "We've come too far to turn back now," he'd say, that silver tongue layering sweet promises of prosperity. "The baby's fine, Maggie's strong as a mule," he joked more than once, though Maggie did not find it especially funny. She was more worried about what she felt inside a swirling mix of terror and love for her unborn child or children, as her mother's instincts whispered, though she had no official word from a doctor. Tension grew among the travelers as they trudged deeper into the western frontier. Rumors about Sioux raiders circulated around campfires. Harriet O'Connell swore that her cousin had seen men vanish along these very trails. Father Jameson offered nightly prayers for safe passage, and Billy Patterson, young though he was, kept glancing over his shoulder with wide, fearful eyes. Maggie listened uneasily. She'd heard enough sensational stories back east about conflicts between native nations and settlers, some true, some twisted into tall tales. She wasn't naive. Violence could erupt from both sides, especially when settlers encroached upon ancestral lands. She also knew that not every story about the Sioux was malicious or cruel. A few eastern newspapers had begun to share more sympathetic accounts, highlighting how treaties had been broken repeatedly by unscrupulous officials, how the Sioux and other tribes were forced to defend their domains. Maggie found herself torn between fear and empathy, praying that if they ever did encounter native people, it would be under peaceful circumstances. Yet her more immediate worry was the tightening in her abdomen and the stabbing pains in her sides. The pregnancy weighed heavily. She often needed to stop and catch her breath, pressing a hand against her belly, as if to reassure the life inside. She confided in Harriet about her suspicions of carrying twins, only to be met with quiet alarm. One blistering afternoon, the train came to a halt near a shallow creek. Maggie tried to stand, but swooned from the effort. Father Jameson, seeing her totter, rushed to her side. Harriet, too, attempted to comfort her. "You must rest. Take water," Harriet insisted, pressing a canteen to Maggie's lips. "The desert doesn't forgive easily." James Turner arrived late to the scene, having scouted ahead. Rather than kneeling next to his wife, he paced anxiously. "This will slow us down," he muttered, seemingly more concerned with progress than with Maggie's well-being. Despite everyone's caution the next morning, James urged the wagon train to move on. They had not found any fresh supplies or prospects, and James was growing impatient. Little by little, Maggie saw her husband's facade fade, replaced by a man driven by greed. Father Jameson tried reason. "She needs at least a few days of rest, son. If you want a family, you need to protect it." With a dismissive wave, James closed the conversation. "Time is money, Father, and we've already lost too much of it." That night, Maggie lay in the wagon, sweat beading on her brow, listening to coyotes yipping under the moon. Fear crawled through her dreams, as if she knew an ominous turn of events was soon to come. They were nearing the region known to many as the High Plains, where dusty sagebrush stretched for miles. The temperature soared, and every breath felt dry as bone. Clyde Barrow, the wagon master, issued warnings. "We must keep the water supply carefully rationed, or we'll run out before we reach the next fort." At this point, tension between James Turner and Clyde had been growing for days. Clyde, who had guided many groups west, knew the land's cruelty. He insisted they conserve resources. James insisted they press on at breakneck speed. Arguments flared nightly. Maggie tried to intervene with a gentle touch on James's arm, but he pulled away, all but snarling. In a final confrontation, Clyde barked, "If you want to kill your wife, keep going like this. But the rest of us won't follow you to certain death. We'll part ways here." James's eyes hardened. "So be it. Maggie and I can fend for ourselves." Father Jameson pulled James aside, pleading for reason, but it was no use. Within hours, the wagon train went in one direction, following Clyde's more cautious route, while James insisted on heading directly west, aiming for rumored silver deposits near the Bighorn Mountains. Maggie, too fatigued to protest, had no choice but to follow her husband's wagon. Alone now, the couple traveled west. It became obvious they didn't have nearly enough supplies for the grueling journey. Water was scarce, and the desert heat felt like a living beast. Days blended into one another. The wheels of the wagon creaked in protest on the stony ground. Maggie's body felt as though it might snap beneath the weight of her pregnancy. At times, she felt two distinct sets of kicks confirming her suspicion they were twins. She tried speaking to James about it, but he barely listened. Only once did he respond. Twins. That's double the mouths to feed Maggie. We need silver more than ever now. His eyes glittered at the mention of wealth, but he avoided her gaze. His once charming veneer seemed gone, replaced by an edge of desperation and bitterness. Then came the day that changed everything. They had spent the last of their water. James had found a few cacti to cut open for moisture, but it wasn't enough. Maggie's lips were cracked, her face sunburned, her feet swollen. The sun was directly overhead, merciless. James helped her down from the wagon to rest under a sparse patch of shade from a boulder. He walked a short distance away, scanning the horizon rifle slung over his shoulder. Maggie thought he was searching for an oasis or anything. When he returned, his face was set. There's a small ravine a few miles up. I'll go on foot to see if there's water. You stay here, rest. I'll bring water back. There was a strange finality in his voice. Despite her weariness, Maggie felt a chill. She managed to reply, Don't go far. Please hurry back. James forced a tight smile. Just stay put. She closed her eyes to the glare of the sun and listened to his footsteps fade. Time crawled. Her stomach churned with hunger. The dryness of her mouth felt like sandpaper. Minutes turned to hours. The sun edged toward the horizon, painting the sky with flaming hues. But James did not return. Maggie tried to stay calm, telling herself he must have gone farther than expected. The hours piled on darkness spread, and still he was gone. Finally, under a canopy of stars, panic seized Maggie. She had no water, no food. She was days away from any known outpost. And now, with fierce clarity, she realized James had left her behind. He had not vanished against his will, he had fled on purpose. Maggie cried out in dismay, but the only answer was the vast emptiness of the desert. Fear and heartbreak melded into shock. She curled up under a thin blanket and prayed for dawn, though she did not know if the rising sun would be her salvation or her doom. By morning, Maggie felt sickly and delirious. Her lips bled from dryness, her skin burned, and waves of pain radiated from her abdomen. This was no ordinary pregnancy cramp. The pain intensified, tearing through her belly, each contraction feeling sharper than the last. She was going into labor alone in a scorching desert. Sweat poured from her brow. She crawled to the wagon in a desperate search for something, anything left behind. In a half-buried crate, she found a ragged canteen with a few drops of water, a dull knife, and some cloth scraps. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was all she had. She screamed as another contraction racked her body. There was no one to hear her, except the indifferent wind. Exhausted, Maggie sank back on the hot earth. She had no time to think, only to endure. She prayed, clutched her belly, and felt life pressing urgently, demanding to enter the world. The entire day blurred into a torturous ordeal. The sun hammered down, and Maggie's voice grew hoarse from crying out. She tried to remember what little she knew about childbirth. She tried to breathe, to push when her body told her to, but the pain eclipsed rational thought. Eventually, well past midday, the first infant's cry cut through the silence, a fragile, trembling sound in an endless sea of dust. Maggie cradled her newborn son, tears cutting through the grime on her face. She wiped his tiny body as best she could, with the cloth severing the umbilical cord with shaking hands and the dull knife. The second child pressed on. Within an hour, she delivered a daughter who let out her own feeble wail. Both were small but alive. But Maggie was terrified. She had no medical help, no nourishment. She was bleeding, trembling with weakness, hardly able to keep her eyes open. And yet she clung to the two precious bundles in her arms, barely daring to hope that she could keep them safe. Night fell once more, bringing a slight relief from the heat, but the desert chill replaced it. Maggie wrapped the infants in her skirt and the ragged blanket pressing them close to her body for warmth. All the while she whispered whatever lullabies she could recall, praying for mercy. It was in that darkest hour before dawn that she slipped into a hazy state between consciousness and oblivion. She dreamt of waterfalls and streams, of a gentle hand reaching out for her, and in the dream she reached back. When Maggie next opened her eyes, the sun had risen again. She felt a shadow pass over her. Trying to focus, she saw a figure silhouetted against the glaring light. At first, fear seized her. Perhaps it was James come back to finish what he started, or a dangerous drifter. But as the figure knelt beside her, Maggie saw a face, marked with compassion and concern, the face of a Sioux man. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple leather vest with an eagle feather woven into his braided hair. In the desert hush, he gently touched her forehead. She heard him utter soft words in a language she did not understand. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. The man carefully brought a container to her lips, letting a trickle of cool water flow into her mouth. It felt like liquid salvation. She almost choked in her desperation to gulp it down. Then, to her astonishment, he repeated the gesture for her newborn children, who whimpered weakly. "Rest," he said in halting English, the word heavy with empathy. He slipped an arm beneath her and helped her to the shade of a nearby rocky outcrop. There he spread a blanket on the ground and motioned for her to lie down. He took out some dried meat and offered a small piece to her, but she could barely chew. Eventually she managed a few bites, and though it was tough and salty, it was sustenance. Throughout the day, the man tended to Maggie and the twins. He used a hollowed gourd to help the babies sip water. He checked Maggie's bleeding, then cut strips of cloth and tied them around her midsection to slow it. She felt too weak to protest or even inquire. All she could manage was gratitude. As the sun sank low, painting the sky purple and orange, the man introduced himself simply as Chaitan, which Maggie would later learn meant falcon in the Sioux language. In between caring for the babies, he explained broken, hesitant English, interspersed with hand gestures that he had come across her wagon's trail by chance tracking a lost horse, and found her near death. Maggie, tears in her eyes, managed a soft, "Thank you." He nodded, his expression somber. "You safe now?" And in that moment, under the fading desert sun, Maggie believed him. Over the next few days, Chaitan helped Maggie regain her strength. He showed her how to create a shade structure by angling her wagon's canvas. He prepared a simple tea from local herbs to ease her pain and increase her milk flow for the babies. Bit by bit, Maggie could sit up and feed her children, though her body still ached with every movement. During one quiet evening, she mustered the courage to share her story, or at least its bare bones. In halting phrases and gestures, she recounted her journey with the wagon train, how her husband's obsession led them astray, and how he abandoned her. The telling drained her emotionally, but she felt a flicker of release. Chaitan listened intently, eyes never leaving her face. She paused, pressing a hand to her heart. "His name was James Turner," she murmured. "He left us. Left me and these children." A sob escaped her. She hadn't yet named the babies, uncertain if they would even survive in these harsh conditions, uncertain of anything. Chaitan's jaw tensed. Though Maggie didn't know the Sioux words, his tone conveyed how appalled he was by James's action. Deserting a new mother and infants in the wild was beyond cruel. It was a death sentence. Without speaking, Chaitan wrapped a buffalo hide around Maggie's shoulders. Then he pulled out a small pouch from his leather satchel. From it, he removed a handful of dried sage and a pinch of tobacco, which he sprinkled on the ground. Maggie watched, puzzled, yet enthralled, as he bowed his head in prayer. She sensed it was a gesture of respect for life, for the mother and children he had saved, or for the great spirit that guided him. That night, she found enough strength to hold both infants at once. "I must name you," she whispered, gazing at their tiny faces. The boy's eyes flickered open for a moment, blue like the big sky overhead. The girl's eyelashes fluttered against her cheek, so delicate. Maggie thought of naming them after her parents, Jonathan and Carolyn, but something inside told her to wait to see if they would pull through this unimaginable ordeal. Survival first. Everything else could come later. By the time Maggie could stand on her own, Chaitan made a suggestion that they head north toward the Powder River country. He gestured to indicate it was a few days' ride. There, he said, they might find one of his band's temporary camps, or at least cross paths with friendly traders. The desert was no place to linger, not with newborns. "You have horse?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling with fatigue as she surveyed her wagon. The horse that once pulled it was nowhere to be found. It may have wandered off or been taken by James. Chaitan shrugged. He had a sturdy bay mare that would not be able to pull the wagon alone. But what choice did they have? They would have to travel lightly, leaving most of the wagon's contents behind. Maggie gathered what meager supplies she had left, bundling spare cloth, the dull knife, and a small trunk of personal items from her marriage, the only relics of a life that now felt like a dream. Before departing, Maggie took a moment to stand over the spot where she had nearly died giving birth. In the distance, she spied vultures circling ominously. She shivered at the memory of absolute desperation. Clutching her babies close, she climbed onto the horse behind Chaitan, grateful for the chance to leave this cursed place. They set out under a blazing sun, traveling during early morning and late afternoon, resting in the shade at midday. Chaitan carried most of the load and the larger water skin. Occasionally he dismounted to scout the path ahead, leaving Maggie to balance on the mare's back, clutching the twins. The days were a slow, laborious crawl, made worse by Maggie's still fragile health. Yet a strange sense of security arose whenever she looked at Chaitan, his eyes scanning the horizon with practiced skill. On the third evening, they discovered a small cluster of cottonwood trees near a shallow stream. Chaitan decided to make camp. He carefully arranged stones for a fire circle and gathered enough kindling to start flames. As the crackling fire reflected in his dark eyes, Maggie found herself marveling at the improbable bond formed between them. It was then that she decided to name her children. She asked for Chaitan's opinion, using gestures to convey the significance of naming. He pointed to the boy, then the wide-open sky overhead, and uttered a Sioux word. Tatanka. No, maybe Wichapi. He paused, uncertain if he should impose. Maggie turned the syllables over in her mouth, feeling them resonate with the boy's spirited gaze. Wichapi, she repeated softly. What does it mean? Chayton considered his limited English. Means star. A tear slipped down Maggie's cheek as she looked at her boy. Wichapi. She agreed, glancing at Chayton with gratitude. She thought of the thousands of shimmering stars that had witnessed his birth in the desert. For her daughter, Maggie chose Hope, an English name, one simple enough that it transcended boundaries. In a land fraught with peril, Hope was the only anchor she had. As they continued north, Chayton hunted small game to supplement their dried rations. He fashioned a makeshift sling for Maggie to carry Hope, while Wichapi rested in another sling across his own broad chest when the horse's back became too cramped. In this awkward, tenuous arrangement, they formed a traveling family of sorts. One late afternoon, trouble arrived in the form of two ragged men on horseback. They appeared on a ridge, rifles angled across their saddles, eyes fixed on the odd sight of a Sioux man, leading a white woman with two infants. Maggie's heart lurched, her mind racing with the stories she'd heard of lawless drifters. Chayton stopped the horse, sliding off silently, while motioning for Maggie to remain mounted and still. The men approached, reeking of whiskey even from a distance. One wore a tattered Confederate jacket. The other had a thick scar across his cheek. They eyed Maggie, then spat on the ground. "Where you headed, Injun?" The scarred man sneered. "And what's this white gal doing with you Maggie's grip on?" Hope tightened. She could sense the men's hostility. They might assume she'd been kidnapped. The tension was thick as dust in the air. Chayton responded with forced calm. "Traveling. To find camp." His English faltering, but his posture resolute. The men exchanged a knowing, cruel grin. One aimed his rifle casually at Chayton. "Looks to me like you might have run off with someone's wife. Hard to believe she's with you willing-like." Maggie found her voice quavering as she tried to intervene. "He saved my life. My husband left me in the desert. I would have died without him," she pleaded, her eyes darting to the muzzle of the rifle. But the men showed no empathy. "Husband left you? That's quite a tale," the scarred man said with a smirk. "Doesn't matter much. Could be a reward for returning you to the nearest fort, or maybe we'll just take the horse and supplies." Chayton stood like a coiled spring. He carefully set Wichapi in Maggie's lap, stepping forward with his hands raised to show he carried no weapon in them. But Maggie knew his hunting knife was hidden at his waist. The men circled the horse, licking their lips at the prospect of loot. Without warning, the one in the Confederate jacket lunged to grab the reins. Chayton instantly reacted, whipping out his knife and slashing the man's hand. The man howled, dropping the reins. The scarred man fired his rifle, but the shot went wide as Chayton knocked the barrel upward. In the chaos, Maggie screamed, holding the twins tight. Chayton wrestled the scarred man to the ground, twisting the rifle away. A second shot roared Maggie, couldn't see who fired. Terrified for Chayton's life, she clutched the infants and slid from the saddle, crouching behind the horse. When the dust settled, both drifters were on the ground. The Confederate jacket man clutched a bleeding thigh, while the scarred man lay still. Chayton stood, panting, rifle in hand, a look of grim resolve on his face. Blood trickled from a graze on his arm. I think we should leave," Maggie stammered, trembling. Chayton nodded in terse agreement. The wounded man cursed and spat, but he was in no position to chase them. With hurried motions, they remounted and galloped away, leaving the drifters in the dust. Maggie's heart pounded as she cradled Wichapi and hope. The ugly encounter underscored just how dangerous the frontier could be, and how precarious their own alliance was in the eyes of others. Several days passed without further incident. Eventually, the terrain shifted from arid flatlands to rolling hills dotted with patches of grass and stands of cottonwood. Chayton grew more assured, as if recognizing landmarks. Maggie felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had mentioned that some in his band did not welcome white settlers due to betrayals and broken treaties. Yet there was no turning back. Their water was low, and the twins needed a stable environment. One crisp morning, as they crested a gentle slope, Maggie saw wisps of smoke in the distance along a meandering river. The sun glinted off scattered lodges, teepees arranged in a loose circle. Chayton stopped, surveying the camp with narrowed eyes. He turned to Maggie, gesturing at the settlement below. "My people," he said. "Not all. Some gone north or west. But some remain." Her chest tightened. She had heard harrowing tales of tensions between the U.S. Army and Sioux camps. She thought of men like Colonel Henry B. Carrington, who built forts along the Bozeman Trail, leading to bloodshed. She had read about famous leaders like Red Cloud, who negotiated fiercely for Sioux rights, or Crazy Horse, who led warriors in defiance of the government's encroachment. She had no idea if these men resided anywhere near, but the sense of historical weight pressed on her. Chayton guided the horse down toward the cluster of teepees. As they neared, figures emerged, curious, some cautious. A few children ran forward, only to be ushered back by adults. Maggie's heart drummed. She clung to hope while Wichapi lay in a sling across Chayton's chest. The atmosphere felt charged with tension. A tall man with braided hair and an air of authority stepped from the circle. His eyes traveled from Maggie to the twins, then finally to Chayton. He spoke in Sioux, his tone interrogative. Chayton responded calmly, pointing to Maggie and the infants. The man listened intently, occasionally glancing at Maggie with wariness or pity. Finally, the tall man nodded. He gestured for them to dismount and approach the central fire. Maggie slid off knees, weak, uncertain of the reception. Chayton introduced her by name, and the tall man introduced himself in English, though haltingly. "I am Black Horse. You. Welcome for now." A cluster of women, some older, some with small children at their hips, approached. They observed Maggie's delicate condition, the babies in her arms, and their expressions softened. One woman with kind eyes stepped forward and motioned to a nearby teepee, guiding Maggie inside. Gratefully, Maggie followed, hoping to find rest and perhaps acceptance, even if temporary. The interior of the teepee was warm, lit by a small fire. The woman with kind eyes introduced herself as Winona. She and an older woman called Kiia immediately attended to Maggie, gently removing the sling that held hope. They cooed over the twins, marveling at their small size, while Maggie sat cross-legged on a buffalo robe, uncertain how to help. Winona beckoned Maggie to eat from a bowl of warm stew. Maggie's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. She murmured thanks in English, which Winona did not fully understand, but the sentiment was clear enough. Kiia examined Maggie's arms and face, clucking softly over her sunburns and bruises. She then turned her attention to the twins, ensuring they were feeding properly. It was a kindness that eroded Maggie's apprehension. She realized that for these women, a mother in need was a universal language. Still, she felt stares from a few men who peered into the teepee or passed by the entrance. She could almost hear their thoughts. Why is she here? What trouble does this bring? In the following days, Maggie discovered just how precarious her situation was. She learned that this band had already encountered harsh treatment from soldiers and settlers alike. Food was scarce. Game was not as plentiful as before. The band was preparing to move north before winter set in, hoping to join a larger encampment under a respected leader, though the name was not always spoken aloud. She overheard talk of Red Cloud's leadership near the Powder River, or of Crazy Horse's more militant approach. Some families had already traveled farther west, while others lingered uncertain which path to take. Chayton was respected among them for his skill as a tracker and hunter, but also viewed with caution due to his willingness to deal with outsiders. A meeting was called around the communal fire one evening, where men discussed Maggie's presence. She was not invited, but she could hear raised voices. Chayton's voice rose at times defending her, describing how he found her in the desert, how she was left to die. In the end, Black Horse announced she could stay until she recovered, but insisted that the band would not alter its movement plans on her account. If she wished to remain with them when they departed, she could, though traveling with a white settler woman might attract unwanted attention from the army. Alternatively, if she could find a way to reach a fort or a trader's post, that might be safer for her. Maggie felt torn. She did not relish returning to a fort where she might be questioned or separated from the only support system she had. Nor could she assume she'd be fully embraced here. But she had nowhere else to go. Her heart ached with indecision each day, overshadowed by the memory of James's betrayal. Over the next weeks, Maggie settled into a tenuous routine. Under Winona's guidance, she learned rudimentary tasks, how to tan hides, grind berries, care for teepees, and gather certain medicinal herbs. She did so partly from gratitude and partly out of a desire to learn. She also wanted to repay the kindness that had been shown to her. At night, Chayton often sat near her or close to where she slept with the twins and shared fragments of his story. He mentioned his father who had fought under Red Cloud when the Bozeman Trail was contested. He mentioned how the treaties made with the U.S. government were often broken land ceded or resources destroyed. Maggie listened with growing empathy. She realized how little she truly knew, how the sensationalist newspapers back east had painted the Sioux as mere antagonists without deeper context. In quieter moments, she confided her own past, her upbringing in Missouri, her marriage that seemed promising until James's ambition spiraled out of control. She spoke of the small church wedding, the looks of pride on her parents' faces, her illusions of forging a frontier farm. The retelling was a balm, though it also sharpened her sense of loss. Occasionally, Chayton took it upon himself to teach Maggie some basic Sioux phrases. She stumbled over the words at first, eliciting gentle laughter from the children, who hovered around, curious about the white woman and her babies. Wichapi and Hope garnered constant attention. The other women helped swaddle them in soft buffalo hides, ensuring they remained warm in the chilly nights. The band was slowly accepting that these two tiny souls were now part of their community, at least temporarily. Every so often, a scout arrived with news from the frontier sightings, of cavalry rumors of new treaties, or the movements of various Lakota and Cheyenne bands. Maggie felt a growing unease. She did not know if the cavalry, if encountered, would see her presence as suspicious, or take her forcibly under their care. She wondered if a man like James might be out there somewhere, gambling away the money from selling the wagon, or forging a new life without remorse. The anger and heartbreak still burned in her chest. As leaves turned golden and the first frost hinted at winter's approach, Black Horse decided it was time to move the camp north. The band dismantled their teepees-packed belongings and prepared horses for a journey toward the Powder River. Maggie faced a crossroads: remain with the Sioux or strike out for a U.S. settlement or fort. But with 2 infants and no resources, how could she travel alone? Moreover, she sensed a certain protectiveness from Chayton and Winona, as if they hoped she would choose to stay. So she chose to follow the band north, despite not knowing what awaited her. On the day of departure, the campsite bustled. Women rolled tippy skins, men checked bows, rifles, and horses. Maggie helped carry bundles with her limited strength. She kept the twins close, worried they might cry and disrupt the carefully orchestrated process. But the babies had grown stronger in the weeks since their birth. Their small coos and giggles re-whitened her heart. The procession set out in a long, winding line. Maggie found herself riding on a travois, a simple wooden frame attached to a horse alongside Winona, who carried her own young daughter. Chayton rode ahead, scouting. They progressed slowly, wary of crossing paths with soldiers or hostile bands. Each night, they made a temporary camp, sometimes among cottonwoods, other times in open fields. During these travels, Maggie felt flickers of hope. She was neither dead nor alone. She had 2 beautiful children, and she was surrounded by people who, despite their initial reservations, showed her more loyalty and kindness than her own husband ever had in that final stretch of desert. She found herself smiling more, even as the nights grew colder. Yet a storm brewed on the horizon, both metaphorically and literally. Scouts reported sightings of a small cavalry patrol further north, possibly from Fort Phil Kearny or another outpost. Rumor had it that a new wave of soldiers was pushing into the territories, determined to keep the roads open for settlers. Black Horse insisted on caution, guiding the band through less traveled paths. One afternoon, the temperature dropped drastically, and dark clouds gathered overhead. The wind howled, carrying the scent of snow. Maggie, seated on the travois beside Winona, clutched the twins, wrapping them in a heavy buffalo hide. The band found a sheltered valley, setting up teepees quickly to brace against the brewing storm. All through the night, the storm raged. Snow and ice pelted the teepees, and the wind threatened to tear them free. Maggie huddled with Winona and several other women, praying the teepees would hold. They placed hot stones near the entrance for warmth, passing the swaddled children from one set of caring arms to another, ensuring they remained safe. In that fierce winter night, Maggie once more thanked the stars for Chayton's intervention in the desert. Without him, she and the twins would never have lived to see this storm, or any storm. Dawn broke clear and cold. The storm clouds dissipated, leaving a thin layer of snow sparkling across the valley. The band emerged from their teepees, shaking off the frost. Some men scouted ahead, checking on the horses. Then came raised voices, agitation in the camp. Maggie, wearing a borrowed buffalo robe around her shoulders, ventured outside to see what the commotion was. Chayton came striding back, an uncharacteristic alarm on his face. He approached Maggie, speaking quickly in a mix of Sioux and English, enough for her to catch the gist. A group of white men, armed, had been spotted just beyond the ridge. Black Horse called a hasty meeting, instructing everyone to remain calm. The men readied their rifles and bows, forming a defensive line at the camp's edge. Women and children were told to stay back near the teepees, prepared to flee if necessary. Maggie's heart thumped. Her mind flashed to the possibility of cavalry soldiers, perhaps outlaws. Before too long, a handful of riders appeared over the snowy slope, rifles bristling. At their head was a rugged man with a wide-brimmed hat, a yellowed bandana around his neck. The moment Maggie saw his face, her blood ran cold. It was James Turner. She almost dropped to her knees from the shock. "He's alive. He's here." She had never imagined he would find her again, especially not among a Sioux band in the middle of nowhere. Her stomach roiled with anger, fear, and confusion. James seemed equally stunned to see her. He halted his horse, peering at the camp. The men behind him were a mix of unsavory types, drifters, possibly hired guns. One wore a Confederate jacket, the other had a scar on his cheek. Maggie recognized them from the violent encounter weeks ago. She realized with horror that they must have joined forces with James. From the defensive line, Chayton stepped forward, positioning himself between the intruders and Maggie. He spoke in Sioux to the band, urging caution. Black Horse barked a warning at James's group, telling them to leave. The tension crackled like lightning. James scanned the camp and locked eyes on Maggie, noticing the babies in her arms. For a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his face. He had clearly not expected that they had survived. Then his features hardened, as though her survival were an inconvenience. "You're alive," he called, voice cold. "I suppose you blame me for leaving. But you made it. I see. And you've taken up with these savages." Maggie's anger flared. "You left me to die," she spat, clutching her children protectively. "These people saved me and our twins. How dare you show your face here?" He glared words dripping with scorn. "You think you're safer here? I came for you, thought maybe you'd want to make things right." She almost laughed at the audacity. "Make things right? You threw me away like trash." Behind James, the scar-faced man hissed, "We've enough of this. These Injuns got supplies. Let's take what we need." He raised his rifle threateningly. In response, the Sioux warriors lifted their weapons, an unmistakable warning. Chayton stepped closer to the intruders, knife in one hand, rifle slung on his back. Snow crunched underfoot. A hush fell, broken only by the horse's nervous snorts. Maggie stood trembling. She realized that if a gunfight broke out, the camp would be in mortal danger. Women and children could be harmed. She had to do something. Summoning courage, she walked forward, the twins secured in a sling, and stood next to Chayton. "James," she called, her voice steady, despite her terror. "If there's any decency left in you, leave now. There's nothing here for you. You gave that up when you abandoned us." James's jaw tightened. He glanced at the men behind him. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. Whether from shame or strategic retreat, Maggie could not tell. "Fine. But don't think this ends here," he sneered. "I hear the army's clearing out hostile camps. Don't be surprised if their guns end up pointed at you." With that, he wheeled his horse around, and his ragged posse followed. The band watched in tense silence as they vanished over the ridge. The next hours were thick with anxiety. The sudden reappearance of James Turner, allied with dangerous men, raised alarm among the band. Black Horse spoke with Chayton and the other leaders, deciding they must move again quickly. They could not risk being tracked or ambushed by James's group, or by the army if James made good on his threat to report their location. Maggie felt a tumult of emotions. The man she once loved had fully revealed himself as selfish and cruel. She was relieved he had left without bloodshed, but the threat of his return loomed. She noticed the suspicious glances from some band members, as though her presence had invited danger upon them. That evening she sat alone by a small fire, the twins asleep in her lap. Chayton found her there, settling beside her in silence for a while. He finally spoke, his voice soft. "I see fear in your eyes. I understand." She inhaled sharply, tears threatening to spill. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry that my being here brings risks to your people. But I can't go with him. I'd rather die." Chaitan studied her face. "You stay if you want. Some do not trust. But I will fight if they come." Maggie's tears spilled over. She had never known such loyalty from anyone, certainly not James. She placed a trembling hand over Chaitan's. "Thank you. For everything." That night, she barely slept. Despite her exhaustion, worry gnawed at her. James might bring the army to their doorstep, or he might simply ambush them in the wild. Either way, the band decided to strike camp before dawn, traveling under cover of darkness to elude potential trackers. They moved swiftly northward. Men rode ahead in small groups, watching for any sign of pursuit. Yet on the third day, disaster struck. In a narrow pass between rocky bluffs, gunshots rang out. James and his men had laid an ambush. Bullets whistled through the air as the band scrambled for cover. Horses screamed, men shouted, women and children scattered. Maggie instinctively threw herself over Hope and Wichapee, shielding them. Chaitan dashed among the rocks, returning fire with his rifle. The band's warriors organized quickly, some flanking the attackers. Maggie peered around a boulder, heart pounding to see James leaning out from behind an outcrop, reloading his weapon. She saw him aim toward the group of women and children huddled near a wagon. An icy fear gripped her. Before she could think, she pressed Hope and Wichapee into Winona's arms. "Take them! Go!" she yelled, her voice cracking, gesturing for Winona to crawl to safety behind some bushes. Then Maggie, pulse roaring in her ears, ran toward James, desperation fueling her courage. She had to stop him. James spotted her and paused, confusion crossing his face. "Maggie, what are you doing?" he barked, as if incredulous that she would stand against him. She advanced, hands held out. Her voice shook with fury. "Stop this madness! You're shooting at women and children!" He spat on the ground. "You chose them over me. You made that choice in the desert," she retorted, tears of rage burning her cheeks. "Go. Leave. Haven't you done enough?" His expression twisted into something feral. He raised his rifle, pointing it at her chest. For a split second, Maggie believed she was about to die. She willed herself not to shrink away, refusing to let him see her fear. A shot rang out, but not from James's gun. It came from behind her. Chaitan. The bullet struck James's shoulder. He cried out, dropping his rifle as blood soaked his sleeve. Behind James, the scar-faced man and the ex-Confederate realized their leader was down. Under the withering fire from Sioux warriors, they cut their losses. Mounting their horses, they fled, leaving James behind. James collapsed to his knees, clutching his wound, cursing. The sound of gunfire died down. Chaitan approached, rifle still raised, eyes like flint. He looked to Maggie for direction. Did she want James to live? Maggie stared at the wounded man, who once was her husband. Her chest felt heavy with regret, anger, pity. "He's not worth killing," she said softly. "Let him face his choices." Black Horse and a few warriors arrived, also glancing at Maggie, silently asking what they should do. She realized they would respect her decision. She met James's pained eyes. "You destroyed everything we had. You abandoned me. Don't you see what you've become?" James grimaced, the arrogance draining from him as he pressed a hand to the bleeding hole in his shoulder. I just wanted to strike it rich," he rasped. Didn't want to be stuck with." He paused as though he realized how monstrous his words sounded. Maggie's tears fell onto the dust. "Take your horse and go," she said, her voice trembling. "If you live, fine. But don't ever come near us again." Black Horse stepped forward, barking a command in Sioux. They hauled James to his feet, tossed him onto a horse, and slapped the animal's hindquarters. Bleeding and hunched, James clung to the reins, casting a last haunted look at Maggie, before riding off into the wilderness. In the wake of the ambush, the band regrouped. Some men were wounded, and one elder had been killed by stray gunfire. It was a day of mourning and exhaustion. Yet there was also a sense of relief James and his posse would no longer pursue them so recklessly. Chayton found Maggie standing at the edge of a small grove, gazing at the rising sun. He approached slowly, resting a hand on her shoulder. Neither needed words to express the emotional weight of what had transpired. Hope and Wichapi were safe, tended by Winona. Maggie turned to Chayton, eyes full of gratitude and sorrow. "I don't know what tomorrow holds," she whispered, "but I know I can't go back to that life." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "You? Stay with us." She swallowed hard. She knew the Sioux faced constant threats, more army patrols, more broken promises. But with them, she had found kindness, a sense of community. And above all, she had found a protector in Chayton and the women who rallied around her. Most of the band, even the initially wary men, now viewed her as a member of their circle. She had defended them, risked her life alongside them. It was a bond forged in hardship. She nodded. "Yes, I'll stay, if you'll have me. If they'll have me," she added, casting a glance toward Black Horse and the other leaders. Chayton's lips curved into a rare smile. "We are strong together," he said. Maggie embraced him, feeling for the first time in her tumultuous journey a sense of belonging. The desert was behind her. James was banished from her future, and she had two precious children who embodied the resilience of life against all odds. Time passed. The band continued north, eventually merging with another group of Sioux families along the Powder River. They built a winter camp, preparing for deep snows and the possibility of army incursions. Maggie, with Winona's guidance, learned more about daily chores, cooking, child-rearing, and even rudimentary herbal medicine. She listened to elders recount oral histories, stories of the land, the animals, the Great Spirit. Hope and Wichapi grew healthier each day, the band's children accepting them as playmates. Maggie marveled at the dichotomy, her twins, half white, half abandoned, now embraced as though they had always belonged. She felt that in bridging two worlds, perhaps she was creating a path to understanding that the official treaties could not. Deep in her heart, Maggie harbored no illusions. Life in this camp would remain fraught with challenges. The US government's expansion westward would bring more conflict. The band might choose to resist, or they might seek negotiations, or they might simply migrate further away from encroachment. Whatever happened, she would stand with them, as they had stood with her. One brisk morning she walked out of her tipi, greeting the dawn with the gentle warmth of Wichapi in her arms and Hope toddling by her side. A new day, a new chapter. And although the horizon held uncertainty, Maggie Turner knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. She turned to see Chayton waiting by the horses, a small smile on his lips. She remembered the desert, the anguish of childbirth under the scorching sun, and the miracle of his arrival. Her life and the lives of her twins were owed to that single act of compassion in an unforgiving land. They joined hands, moving forward together. The vast sky stretched overhead, no longer a symbol of hopelessness, but one of infinite possibility. Thank you for joining me on this journey through dust-laden trails and heart-pounding ambushes. We watched Margaret Turner defy death on a scorching desert floor, only to find salvation in the outstretched hand of a Sioux man named Chayton. In that cruel wilderness, compassion bridged cultures, shaping a story of family, forged by fate rather than blood. If this tale spoke to your sense of hope, resilience, and the boundless ability of the human spirit to find light in the shadows, then please let others discover it too. Like this video, if you believe courage and kindness can conquer even the harshest frontiers, share it with anyone who loves stories of redemption and unexpected alliances. Subscribe to the channel to explore more epic sagas that celebrate the unbreakable bonds we form against all odds. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Thank you.